Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ill Factor from beatacademy.com. I want to share some music production tips and techniques that you can use in your projects while recreating the beat in Billie Eilish's NDA. Let me show you the finished result. Now, before we move forward with breaking this down, the goal of this video is not necessarily to find or dial in the exact patch or preset that was used by the artist, but understanding the underlying why behind the decisions I'm making to create the sounds that are similar to what we hear in the reference, and how we can implement that into our own workflows and use them in our own projects. I also want to take this time to remind you, if you're a singer songwriter or an artist that's just looking to step up their game with producing their own music, and you're looking for professional guidance to do that, then I want to encourage you to visit beatacademy.com and take advantage of all the resources that I have available for you there, as well as the mentorship opportunities to help you take your next step with your music production. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the drums. So we're going to be focusing on the chorus of the song, which has a lot of distortion going on all the elements, the drums, bass, and all the instrumentation that goes with that. So focusing on the drums, I'm thinking, where does my mind go to when trying to select the actual sounds to start with? I want a nice short, beefy kick drum. So I've got like an 808, a short 808 kick here. Then I want a snare that has a lot of that presence or that kind of thing that and so immediately my mind goes to like a 909 snare drum. That's what we're going to be using. And then I've got an 808 clap. Now you could click the link below in the description box to download this session and follow along, as well as the sounds that I'm using to recreate this. So let's look at the pattern. So let's head over to the kick drum, and I'm going to use the onboard filter frequency here that comes in the sampler, and just to remove a lot of that high-end clippy type of sound. That's going to help push it a little further back in the mix. And then using Ableton Live's Saturator, one of my favorite plugins to use. We're going to just crank the drive a little bit, about 6.29, and lower the output, but then messing around with the bass knob right here, and that determines how much saturation is going to be applied to the lower frequencies. So and now let's focus on the snare drum, the 909 snare sample. And now the first initial reaction would be, well, let's add some distortion to get more of that crunchy type of presence from it. But believe it or not, being able to mess around with the pitch envelope of your sounds can really do amazing things in getting you the right type of textures that you might be looking for. So for instance, here, let's head over to the controls and let's enable our pitch envelope. And this is going to determine how the pitch of the sample reacts depending on how we set the envelope. So if we have, let's say, a very slow attack, and I set the amount to -15 semitones, that means that it's going to take a while for that sample to reach -15 semitones. If we do an immediate attack, as you can see, it quickens the rate at which that sample pitches down. So you can go ahead and mess around with the decay. And come up with some really cool results. In this case here, I don't want the decay to happen too long. And that initially, just moving the decay, leaving the attack there, and maybe snapping the release a little bit. Let's take the pitch envelope off. It's a nice high-pitched tight 909 snare. Put the envelope back on. And having it pitch down a little like that extends that presence part. And it almost sounds like it was distorted, but it gives a better texture. That way, when we start to apply things such as this pedal plugin here, which is some overdrive distortion, we're going to crank a lot of that on it. It really focuses the attention of the distortion on the noise part of that snare. And I've got a little bit of treble there. And then I'll use an EQ directly after that distortion pedal to carve out some of the low end and warm up the actual snare drum with taking some high end off. Depending on the length of the note here in the MIDI section, will actually give you a different response from the sample. So you can see here, this might need to be extended a little bit. And then let's go ahead and layer that with our clap. Select the whole thing. And the clap will be a little bit brighter. So let's head over to the clap. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Let's go to the control. And this I'll just pitch down. And I'll go to the sample. And I want to just move this ahead a little bit. Now I'm going to use a drum bus plugin on the whole drum rack. So this is going to create some more drive, some crunch in the mid-range, and then we'll bring up just a little bit of transients to enunciate the initial punch of the kick and snare, and crank up the boom section here to get a lot more low-end harmonic saturation. And then after the drum bus, I'm going to be using Ableton Live's glue compressor. And one thing I'm doing, I'm going to do some parallel compression. That means we're going to have a little bit of the dry as well as the compressed signal. The way I want to do this is leave this at 100% and dial the threshold down to I get a desired punchiness from the drums. Now, when I listen to the reference, the drums are a bit punchy, but there's a bit more body to that. And that's the reason why I'm doing the parallel compression. Because having the threshold here and with somewhat of a slow attack and a quick release, that's going to really accent the initial transients and punch of these drums. As without it. So I do like the beef that's there with the kick drum. But I do like how tight the kick and how leveled the kick and snare are. So using right where we're at here, let's just dial back the dry and wet. I like where it's at now. And I want to do one more thing. I want to add a reverse hit here. So I'm going to copy this snare drum by holding Option. And we are going to take the right here where it says sample, just click and hit reverse sample. And then that'll give us reverse, right? And then we'll nudge this over to make it a little quicker. And we're going to take the pitch envelope off. And then what we'll do is in here, now let's draw in our reverse. And so I know where it's at in my drum rack. I'll just go ahead and call this REV for reverse. And I'll go ahead and place this over here. Now, similar to the parallel compression, we're also going to do some parallel processing with some distortion on these drums. So if you notice here, we have these sends, send A, B, C, and D. I'm going to focus on send C. And here's my return track C in Ableton Live. And here we have another Ableton Live pedal distortion plugin set to fuzz. We have a lot of gain up there. And then we have after that a digital distortion and then an EQ to just take away a lot of the low end. So I'm going to send a little bit of the drums over to this processing, this distortion chain. And it's just getting really gritty and dirty. And what we're trying to do here is just give a little bit extra texture and then just blend that in with the dry signal. So I'll just solo the signal here alone, right? And then I'll just maybe, I could either send a little bit of that or just blend the output of that down. So it's just adding a little bit more texture on top of that. And believe it or not, it's all about these small little nuanced details that give that polished professional sound, right? It's just these small little details that go a long way. Now, the bass has this nice pulsating vibe to it, as well as is really distorted, but not bright as what we hear with the drums. So, to get the pulse action going, we're going to use an arpeggiator to do that. So, I'm using Ableton Live's arpeggiator, and you get access to that by going to the MIDI effects folder, grabbing the arpeggiator, and placing that before the MIDI instrument. So, let's turn that on, and we're going to set the rate to eighth notes here. So, as we look at our notes here, instead of just playing these as whole notes, it'll now play them at an eighth note interval. Now, sine wave is way too low or just too dull of a sound. So we're for our first oscillator, let's set to a sawtooth. And first thing we do, since this is going to be our bass line, is go from polyphonic to monophonic so that we're not getting any overlap. So we've got it set to a sawtooth on oscillator 1. Let's set oscillator 2 to a sine wave. And then what we're going to do is lower the frequency filter right here. And we want to assign the frequency filter to our envelope. So let's head over to the matrix and assign just by clicking the frequency and assign that over to envelope 2. And what that's going to do is it's going to make that every note that plays a little bit more prominent. Without it, you just have a, it's very hard to distinguish each note. So let's just play around with that, maybe just around 30 or so. And then head over to the envelope, envelope 2, and shape that around. I don't want it too short. And I want to maybe extend the sustain a little bit more. There's definitely some tail end to that bass as we hear that. And then we can widen this up a little bit by using the unison. So I head over here to classic. Okay, now let's give it the grit that we hear. So for that, I'm going to use the Overdrive plugin. Ableton Live stock plugin, another great plugin I love using on a lot of my tracks here. So let's just crank up the drive. And what's important is the dynamics here. You want to make sure that we're more towards the lower or the shorter value of the dynamics, because the more dynamic you put in the overdrive, the more glued that saturation is going to be from one note to the next. And it really takes all that low end away. And then using an EQ directly after that to kind of shape the tone. I went over back to the amp envelope and to the body of, and raised the release a little bit because I just thought it was a little too more staccato. So now let's go ahead and use some sidechain compression to give of that pulse action that we hear. So I'm going to sidechain compress from the drum rack, and we're going to use the kick drum. I'm going to set it over to pre-effects, and so the kick drum is going to be the source that causes the the bass line to duck. And so now let's hear it with the drums. A couple things to notice here about the settings on the sidechain is that we're getting a real extreme sidechain here from the compressor. So I've got the ratio set to 5:1, 5.73:1, quick attack, quick release. The threshold is really, really low. And instead of peak, meaning that the threshold is reducing the peak, it's going to work on the RMS mode, which is the overall average volume. And so that was the effect I was going for. And also, similar to what we've done with the drums, let's also send a little bit of this bass over to that return track C that has a lot of the distortions on there. So that also comes in handy to blending in some more distortion with all the other elements in the song. All right, now I want to work on this cool harmonic high sound that we hear happening throughout the chorus that's kind of layered on top of the bass. Not sure exactly what it is, but I want to start working on creating something that falls near that type of sound. So I'm going to be using Ableton Live's analog. And if you're not using Ableton, you can follow along using any 2 or more oscillator synth that you might have, because we're essentially just going to be using 2 sawtooths pitched way up and adding some distortion on them. So here we have the Arpeggiator plugin, once again, creating that 8th note interval. And then I'm going to set our first oscillator to a sawtooth and just we go 3 octaves higher. I need to go 1 more octave, so I'll use the semitone button and turn that all the way up by 12. So we'll do 12 steps higher. I'm going to do the same thing for the second oscillator and just slightly detune 1. We can add a little bit of white noise there and just lower the volume. Then we can use our filter frequency cutoff just to make it a little bit easier to identify the separation of that rhythm. Once we have that set there, let's go ahead and take our second oscillator. Instead of sawtooth, we'll set it to sine wave. And let's go ahead and use some amp simulation right here. So this is the Ableton Live amp simulator under the audio effects plugin. And we have it set to the heavy setting. I'll lower the volume. And then creating a cabinet. So I'm going to use the cabinet plugin. And that's going to soften the distortion a little bit. And then we've got a filter, which we're using, as you can see here, with some automation. So this is going to swell or build up, and it's causing some tension to be present in the transition in that chorus. And then next, we're going to use a reverb directly inserted on top of that. And that's just a really cool sound. So I might just open up the filter frequency a little bit. And now I'm just going to use a sidechain. Same parameters and settings that we had for the bass line. Let's just go to drum rack and choose the kick drum as our source. And that's just a really cool sound. And I personally would do this throughout my productions to actually build some anticipation and tension, maybe leading into a chorus or leaving out of a chorus, such as what we're hearing here. Let's go check it out with the rest of the instruments. Now I'm also going to send a little bit of that to the return track C. And then when I listen to the reference, there's this faint organ that's being played throughout this chorus. And this is just a cool texture that kind of glues the elements that we already have in place together. So for this, I simply just typed the word organ into my search field, head over to my instruments, and then looked up the different organ patches under the instrument rack. Came across organ rough, decided to go with that one. And so this is what we have. And then with the organ, I'm going to copy the same exact MIDI and drag that over to another MIDI track with an electric piano loaded. So I'm using the electric preset or the electric instrument that comes with Ableton Live. And this is just an electric piano. Now, what I'm trying to do here, I'm going to layer this with the organ, but I want to create a more spacious and maybe create some of the high-end sparkle. And what we're going to do is just place a reverb directly onto this. So I'll go to Audio Effects, and particularly we're going to use the hybrid reverb because we have this cool shimmer preset in here. And what this is, we can create a whole octave higher so that the reverb transposes an octave higher, and it's going to create the nice little sparkle that I was talking about. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the stereo width there. And the vintage mode, we'll just put old. And maybe run this a little bit through some of the distortion as well. So it's something that's more like felt than really dominant or heard. Now, one thing I want to implement that will really create a nice sizzle type of glue for all these instruments is similar to what we did with placing a distortion on our return track C and sending a little bit of that signal from each track over to the distortion. I'm going to do the same thing, but yet I'm going to use an erosion plugin here. So this is on my return track D. So I'm using the Ableton Live erosion, which is really just adding some noise and then just cutting off the low end. And what I'm going to be doing is just sending this to every track. So every track is going to have some of this erosion. And this is really going to give the over-the-top sizzle that we can hear in the reference. So let me go ahead and bypass both of these return tracks over here. Pretty cool, huh? So you can see how using parallel processing, such as having a little bit of distortion on our return track C, having that noise erosion on D, really helps bring that extra layer of life to the track. Well, I hope this video was helpful for you. And as my gift to you for watching, I would like to send you a sample pack loaded with loops and one-shots, as well as this Ableton Live set for those of you following along using Ableton. You could follow along. I'll also export some of the sounds. So if you're using any other DAW, you can have access to that as well. Simply click the link below in the description box to get access to that. And if you're serious about wanting to take your next step with producing your own music, whether you're an artist, singer, songwriter, not wanting to wait on other people to produce stuff for you and you're ready to hit the ground running producing your own music, or whether you're producing for other artists, whatever the case may be, visit beatacademy.com to help take your next step with producing your music. Receive the professional guidance that you're looking for and use all the resources that I have available for you there. Once again, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you can stay up to date with upcoming videos, and I'll see you next time.